it occurred to me when I was looking over the schedule that the way this worked was there was a Canadian at the beginning, and immediately followed by someone at Canadian University, and then Paul was just before me. And so it's a lovely, it's a kind of all the rest of the world sandwich with Canadian bread on each end. And I wondered if it was actually in commemoration of the fact when we were traveling in from Brussels, a man on the train said, well, you know, this is a big weekend for Canadians because they celebrate the liberation through. So I thought, oh, okay, so that's why you did all this. It's very canny organizing. That's the last thing that we should thank Mario and Daniel for doing. So Daniel pointed out to me that I had copied the color of the conference, and that was a complete, obviously inadvertently done. So I should say at the outset that I need to acknowledge the contributions of two people for portions of this work. It partly makes use of research that was done in collaboration with, on the one hand, Nick Shaw from the University of Toronto, and then the aforementioned Denise McKenna in California. So without their contributions, at least some of this wouldn't be able to be here. And but I will say, as I often say at the beginning of books, that any faults you find here are entirely my responsibility. They're not here to defend themselves. Okay. So why would a keynote occur at the end of a conference? And what place does a keynote devoted to transitional cinema rightfully have in a conference about attractions? So the literal answer to the second question helps to answer the first. So here I find myself positioned appropriately to determine the relevancy that transition possesses for an ongoing examination of attractions. We can concede that transition has always followed attraction, both as an historical phenomenon and as a concept designed to describe and explain said phenomenon. Insofar as the transition postdates the attraction, it can be read as the period of the attraction's absorption, its displacement, even its rejection. Similarly, the concept of transition flirts with attraction's negation. But I would argue further that if the attraction is yoked to a period of indeterminacy, where cinema can scarcely function as the medium it has not yet become, the transition speaks to a counterposed process of self-definition. This is not affirmation of an identity, but rather, to borrow from Rick Altman, hesitancy in the face of self-definition. Ultimately, the Longue Durée of transition measures the unfolding process of what Santiago Hidalgo has called cinema consciousness. Moreover, transition's persistence as a preferred label to describe what happens after attractions demonstrates how conceptual categories evolve and in so doing retain their historiographical efficacy. When I first wrote about transition, and this was something I couldn't have guessed, but Brian Jacobson actually signaled it, to my horror, giving it a date. I wasn't going to date it, but at any rate. When I first wrote about transition, and I should get my act together and get my slides going, it was as a graduate student. So just so you don't, the horror is somewhat qualified by that. In an essay about D.W. Griffith that would eventually be published in Cinema Journal. Griffith has never stood completely apart from transition since that moment, though he has uneasily existed within its boundaries. Griffith represents so many seismic shifts, a profound change to narration, a heightening of the director function, an impulse to render cinema a respectable cultural form, that he initially became interchangeable with transition before its first full elaboration decreed the auteur an anomalous and anachronistic distraction. Where Griffith proved particularly helpful was in establishing the temporal boundaries of the transitional period. His entry into the industry coincided with the nominal beginning of transition in 1907, and his departure from Biograph and disavowal of the single reel format occurred as its endpoint of 1913. But as the title of my talk is meant to suggest, transition has not only persisted in the scholarly lexicon, the period itself has seen its duration extend so that the transitional era now covers a time span that might end anywhere from the late 19-teens to the early 1920s. The explanation for transition's endurance as a category and its extension as an historically defined period stems from the same confluence of factors. out of dissent has arisen productively amended explication. The ongoing refinement of how we define the term indicates that transition is a concept amenable to revision and responsive to critique. And there has been no lack of critique. Transition has been criticized as relentlessly teleological, too tethered to the classical model that it precedes, but also derided as nebulous, describing nothing more than a state of becoming. It has been charged with being guided by an Americentric perspective, ignoring distinct tendencies evident in other national and cultural contexts, but also of overlooking the degree to which other cultures exerted influence over the American model. Some see it as too beholden to a model of film history that is excessively text-focused, while others view it as misconstruing the nature of the textual operations it defines. If a concept stays around long enough, it will be battered from every side, is really what you can take from that. At any rate, rejecting its assumptions, some scholars have reached for other terms, ranging from the single reel era to short film cinema. I cannot claim to have exerted control over all of the changes that the term transition has undergone since it was coined nearly 3 decades ago. But I have actively contributed to the broadening of its initial conceptual boundaries to include the extra-textual dimensions of transition in the US. Phenomena that include the introduction of the star system, the establishment of an industry-specific trade and fan press, and the emergence of a bi-coastal management system. The accommodation of the extra-textual was signaled in the publication of the anthology, on the right, American Cinema's Transitional Era, which deliberately included the subtitle Audiences, Institutions, Practices to indicate how the ambit of the term transition had expanded beyond the concerns of story style and filmmaking, which had been the focus of my first book. At the same time that extra-textual concerns played a much more important role, the volume's co-editor Shelley Stamp and I also made the conscious decision to extend transition's endpoint to 1917 to coincide with the purported advent of classicism. As we wrote then, quote, "If we have selected the years between 1908 and 1917 to mark the transitional era, it is not to insist that all relevant phenomena fit neatly within such a time frame, but rather to suggest the significance of so many notable changes occurring in rough synchronicity." Pushing transition forward into the later 19-teens seemed a reasonable accommodation of different tendencies evident in cinema scholarship, including parallel conceptual categories that emerged in light of increased research into the nature of change in the silent era. One such set of categories came courtesy of my esteemed fellow keynote speaker, André Gautreau, coining the term, now does anyone want to say this along with me? I can never say it right. Kinematography? At any rate, probably a good thing he's not here and become ill all over again. Anyway, coining that term to describe the first years, Gautreau with Philippe Mérion suggested that early cinema was not really cinema at all, but rather an endeavor deeply intertwined with pre-existing phenomena derived from extra-cinematic cultural series. Cinema per se comes into being at the point of its institutionalization, which Gautreau has suggested might occur anywhere between from 1910 to 1915, clearly in line with transition's chronology. Joel Frickom, to take one example of a scholar who has compared the two concepts, offers this verdict. He says, "Recently, institutionalization rather than transition has become the preferred word to describe how one type of cinema metamorphosed into a different one. Instead of early cinema transitioning into classical Hollywood, there is a process of institutionalization," these are his quotes, "through which cinema acquires a degree of stability, specificity, and legitimacy, but not necessarily by moving toward a predestined goal, classical Hollywood cinema, as the term transition supposedly imply." Now, leaving aside the question of whether transition includes change toward a goal, or simply from a definably different state, and deferring the fraught issue of whether institutionalization is the preferred term, I want to pause here to suggest how attractions operate within a context defined by transition and/or institutionalization. And I will suggest that we keep these two terms separate for reasons I will explain briefly later. So this is where the clips will come in, and I want to thank the technical assistance person for making sure that this would go as smoothly as it can. So we'll see. So the first film I want to see is a short film from 1904, and we had to insert another PowerPoint slide to make sure this would work properly. This is photographing a female crook, as you can see, from 1904. And this would seem to fully embody, and yes, the pun is intended, an aesthetic of attraction.
Next one.
Yeah, next slide. I haven't advanced it. Yes, thank you very much. Even when I have it all done for me, I can still mess it up. There we go. In photographing a female crook, the spectacle of the female crook's facial contortions becomes the film's visual raison d'etre, its ostensible point of pleasure. The camera's unrelenting attempt to record the physiognomy of the arrested woman is reinforced by both the machine's unceasing forward movement and the diegetic camera on the right side of the frame, which replicates the process of photographic capture mobilized by the track in. Confronted by a mechanical process designed to implicate and disarm her, the woman uses the only response at her disposal, a distortion of her face in repose. The conflict between her ever-changing face and the insistent, predictable movement of the camera creates a dialectic of visualization that results in the woman eventually relenting, her emotional breakdown signaling the triumph of a destabilizing technology associated with a zeal for penetration and discernment. All the hallmarks of the cinema of attractions present themselves in this film. The direct address of the camera, though we might ask ourselves which camera, the insistence on display, both the photographed subject and the technological process responsible for the image, and the diminishment of any narrative pretext for the spectacle beyond that readily telegraphed in the descriptive title. The film is almost all process and no story. Let us now compare photographing a female crook to the final moments of a film released exactly 10 years later, and one that features a similar emphasis on female facial contortion. And that film is Daisy Doodads Dial. I'm going to move ahead to the -7-minute and 40-second spot. And so we are only going to see the end of this film. I'm not really interested in the narrative of it, simply the final moments. One must also consider that Daisy Doodads Dial is designed to be a showcase for its lead actor, Florence Turner. One of the earliest film stars who had recently left Vitagraph, the company where her fame had been established, to make films in England. The facial contortions in Daisy Doodads Dial are not the anonymous face-pulling of an unheralded actress, but the calling card of a named performer, one who is counting on the recently established star system to bolster her efforts to establish herself as a screen personality in the UK. Turner had prepared for acceptance of her films in the British market by appearing extensively in a series of music hall performances, part of a tour that lasted for 3 years. Her mimicry and facial contortionist number, first introduced in American vaudeville theaters in 1913, just prior to her departure for England, established her as a well-received live act in both countries, at the same time that it provides an essential intertextual frame for Daisy Doodads Dial. and this frame must meaningfully account for Turner as a film star. She had ranked highly in recently inaugurated trade press polls of most popular motion picture actresses. The calculus had shifted. Movies needn't import actors who had gained fame on stage. Now film success could translate into a calling card for live performance promotion. Daisy Doodads' Dial represents the intersection of filmic text and cultural context, and the attraction of Turner's outsized face-pulling is one that is integrated into a matrix of narrative and cross-medial publicity. By 1914, then, the cultural landscape within which cinema operates has changed, and the model of transition must be sensitive to the changes. Attractions continue to play a role, but the force of institutionalization alters cinema's terms of self-definition. Indeed, for the institutionalization of cinema to take hold, cinema had to be enacted and understood as an integrated set of formal properties, industrial practices, reception patterns, and discursive strategies. We can now register that process of cinema's reimagination in many developments that mark the early 19-teens. From the American film industry's move to the West Coast to the development of a codified representational system defined in part by new functions for editing. But as I've tried to establish in my work on these developments, by deploying the term transitional, the period of change that early cinema underwent prior to full institutionalization was anything but a preordained march to the end goal of classicism, nor the concerted actions of an industry certain of its ultimate structure. In fact, the transitional period, the era where institutionalization is in the process of becoming, is marked inevitably by equivocation, inconsistency, and disagreement. One can see transition's trademark hesitancy on display when examining the way editing was imagined during the period of cinema's institutionalization. The narrative editing's development during the transitional period is all too familiar to us now. We recognize its changed spatiotemporal capacities registered in American films made between 1908 and 1913. In particular, the popularization of cross-cutting, a technique used with increasing dexterity and dynamism by D.W. Griffith at Biograph, signals the ascendancy of this type of editing most emphatically. Our familiarity with that narrative might lead us to think that the changes to editing evident at the level of filmic text resulted in a concurrent wholesale reimagination of editing by the trade press. Such a reconceptualization of editing would have produced ready acceptance of the continuity system by the early to mid-19-teens. But in fact, the process was far less straightforward than that. What one can observe by examining trade press discourse during the years immediately following Griffith's departure from Biograph is the very sort of indeterminacy that Altman has attributed to periods of technological identity confusion. If editing changed its functions, rather radically, in the hands of filmmakers like Griffith during the early years of transition, how did such changes prompt those writing about cinema to reconsider editing as a formal practice? In other words, as editing moved toward codification, becoming a building block for the continuity system that would prove foundational for classical cinema, how did critics, columnists, and other trade press writers register this process? What kind of editing consciousness, to alter Hidalgo's term, is on display in their writing about editing? What words did they use to describe it? What traditions of cutting, in the sense of deletion and arrangement of material, were invoked in efforts to make sense of filmic editing? And how was editing's role in the storytelling process conceived and sanctioned, or resisted, by cinema's critical gatekeepers? The messy contours of the reception of editing within the trade press do not alter the fact that continuity editing eventually became a key feature of classical filmmaking, but they do remind us, following Altman, that we must understand the process of institutionalization in dialectical terms. In what follows, I will pursue three strands of inquiry that should help us understand better how the trade press attempted to make sense of editing in the critical period of 1913 to 1917. The industry's ability to translate filmmakers' use of editing into an intelligible set of practices seems integral to the institutionalization of cinema. Perhaps not coincidentally, these attempts at defining editing coincided with early examples of theorizing the effects of editing on spectators by outside figures like Hugo Munsterberg. All such pronouncements on the representational capacities of the medium foster a more particularized notion of its identity, helping to crystallize a working notion of cinema. First, I will examine the terminology used to describe editing during this period. highlighting which names for editing processes were preferred and what that tells us about editing consciousness at this time. Second, I will note what types of prohibitions and advisories were issued by those critics who were alert to the use of editing within films of the day. Third, I will look at the influences that likely conditioned the ways that editing was discussed and defined. Collectively, these observations will paint a portrait of industry commentators learning how to reconcile themselves to the new fact of editing's ascendancy, and how to chart their own course in having a say about the ways editing should be used and understood. After consulting 9 different trade journals and a few manuals for aspiring scriptwriters, I found that instances of editing being mentioned by name increased significantly after 1915. Up until that year, in the period from 1911 to 1914, references to editing tended to hover around 20 to 50 mentions per year. But starting in 1915, one sees a dramatic jump, nearly tripling in that year, and going up more than 50 again the following year. Now, one cautionary note that I should insert here is that editing can also refer to scenario editing. But that semantic blending possesses its own pertinence, for at least 2 reasons. First, the idea of what editing entailed seems to be equally indebted to what happens on the script writing level as to what occurs in post-production. In both instances, one is considering how to truncate material, rendering it more concise and ideally more compelling. Second, scripts themselves often issued a call for some form of editing in the instructions that they provided. At the very least, they might structure themselves with an eye to having their storytelling approach conveyed through different forms of editing, such as cross-cutting. So given the interrelationship of editing as it occurred on the page and editing as it was enacted on the screen, one of the tasks of trade press writers during this time was to disentangle these 2 forms of editing and strive to render each distinct. In part, this occurred by identifying with greater emphasis the role of the director and/or producer, who was understood to help decide how to implement editing at the post-production stage. This more precise identification of the director function and the attendant division of labor that would see various aspects of the task of editing further delineated contributes to the institutionalization of cinema, insofar as granting a certain autonomy to the director suggests the artistic ambitions of the medium, which help it accrue increased cultural capital. But when trade press writers mentioned editing, what did they call it? As we might expect, they employed the terms cutting, pruning, assembling, and of course, editing. Of more interest, perhaps, are the terms used to designate particular forms of editing, such as cutback and flash. Cutback seems designed to refer to what we now call cross-cutting, where the cutting back and forth assumes a primarily spatial function, alternating between 2 distinct zones of diegetic action. But it also seems intended to describe cutting from across a temporal divide, as in a flashback. This somewhat confusing terminological indeterminacy indicates either that writers had not yet settled on how to identify what were emerging as primary functions of editing, or could not always distinguish completely between the temporal and spatial dimensions of editing. To add to the confusion, some writers also labeled the cutback the return. The use of flash points to a different issue, which is the attempt to describe an effect of editing that hadn't yet been codified to any degree. Flash seems to indicate a particularly brief shot, such that it only remains on screen long enough to provide a flash of imagery. But it also alludes to a type of apparently self-conscious continuity, as when a commentator points out its deployment in Tilly's Punctured Romance from 1914, saying that, quote, when one person pushes another, we are then suddenly shown the next scene where the person lands into a crowd of policemen or other bystanders and knocks them into a heap or into the water. In this case, the flash and cutback are conflated in text and description in an account that differently seems to register a simple match-on-action cut for spatial relations and comedic effect. One gets a sense of the uncertain glossaries and polymorphous definitions as the trade press and practical handbook authors contend with novel editing forms becoming trans-textual norms. Overcoming imprecision, however, is predominantly expressed as dependent on the effectual narrative development of such techniques by singerists and manufacturers. As industrial commentary and how-to writings endeavored to outline and codify functions of editing protocols, these devices were then increasingly linked to the sustenance of a story's flow. as when pictures and the picture-goer refers to the cutback as, quote, alternating continuity. As we have already seen, at this stage in cinema's development, no consensus existed regarding the roles of editing in the fostering of narrative continuity. Commentators seem split on the cutback, with some praising films that use it with skill, while others chastise filmmakers for relying on it excessively. And I have to say, I have a number of quotes here, and I'm now wishing that I had conferred with Casper and Paul in advance and just had them come up and perform various quotes that are here. It may still happen. So at least one reviewer, writing about an adaptation of Hedda Gabler from 1917, comments that, quote, practically all angles of the story get exposition on the screen, oftentimes, however, at the sacrifice of continuity through the enforced explanatory cutback scenes that the picturizing calls for. In this instance, the cutback is critiqued precisely because it endangers proper continuity. Certainly, trade press writers were becoming increasingly devoted to the idea of technique serving storytelling during this period, with many expressing the view that individual devices had to become subservient to an overarching narrational program. As long as devices like the cutback were used judiciously to achieve storytelling proficiency as a, quote, means to an end, as one commentator put it, then they received approval. Epis Winthrop Sargent summarizes this attitude when he pronounces that, quote, the cutback, the close-up, the dissolve, the vision, and all old and some new tricks will be used, but they will be used intelligently to further advance the story. Or, as film executive Fred Balschaffer was quoted as saying to Metography, quote, proper cutting of pictures is just as essential as good stories, photography, or casts. No matter how good a story is, if it fails to contain simplified continuity, and if the chief characters are not brought in front of the audience often enough, you are just as far from having a successful photoplay as though you were dealing with a poorly constructed theme. On the other hand, you can improve the quality of a poor story with good cutting. In such pronouncements, the trade press was both reflecting what it could discern, filmmakers' accelerated reliance on a set of editing procedures, and attempting to prescribe the preferred use of such procedures. While the press could not dictate how editing developed during this time, it could comment on those developments, and the discourse on editing, as I mentioned earlier, indicates the uncertainty concerning editing's ultimate role in cinema's developing representational system. Further complicating any coherent conceptualization of editing was the fact that it derived from practices established in numerous other media and institutions. Here, if we return to the issue of terminology, a notion of the multifaceted origins of editing becomes clearer. The abundance of names for editing speaks to separate etymological lines leading back to distinct points of origin. Pruning relates to theatrical practice, specifically the music hall. Assembling points to industrial production, and editing derives from print periodicals and journalism. Each of these terms in its use represents a shifting paradigm of thought about the nature of what we now retrospectively characterize as film editing, though the process of synthesizing these meanings into a single recognizable term entailed years of discursive testing. The manner in which the trade press treats editing, sorry Andre, all the references to you are already done.
What did he say?
I'll have to back up and start with the part about you.
But I've got the text.
Oh, that's right.
I read a part of it. I'm trying to catch up.
I'm on page 12.
Well,
I know everyone's going, page 12? How could it only be page 12?
Wait. My printing is not the same.
Well, then you're just going to have to figure it out. The manner in which the trade press treats editing indicates that we might wish to reformulate historiographical conceptions about how transitional era editing signals a key break from the heritage of earlier cultural forms, especially those typically viewed as non-cinematic. The opposite might be true, at least from the perspective of the dominant discourse. The trade press seems to conceive the phenomenon of editing according to familiar models of reduction, selection, and organization. Following and slightly amending what Altman has suggested about changes to representational technologies, I would suggest that ideas about film editing seem to develop in a context of pre-existent standards. The previously discussed confusion between scenario editing and editing in the realm of post-production proves this point. The confusion derives from the idea that editing, more so than cutting, pruning, or assembling, involved the shaping and reworking of material in a process akin to what journalistic editors execute. The migration of the term such that it applied equally to the work of different kinds of cutters may have been abetted by the fact that the journalistic analogy could be applied easily to magazine-style short subjects, such as the Paramount Burton Holmes travel pictures or the Wildlife of American Films series. And also newsreels like Pathé News, Select Tribune, Hearst Vitagraph, where the work of shaping occurred after filming was completed. In the case of newsreels, fragmented film clips had to be transformed into coherent news stories and then groups of stories, so the work of editing there could be compared to what occurred in newspapers. One can see this in a column by Frankie Woods entitled Editing a Motion Picture, where he says, quote, "The motion picture is a form of publication. It might well be called the celluloid press." Wood goes on to indicate how each of the stages of motion picture production corresponds to equivalent moments in the creation of a newspaper. Sometimes to the detriment of the finished product, quote, "There may be little or no proofreading, and the cutting and titling may be done by cheap and incompetent help, and not by experienced editors. The finishing of a picture, the cutting and titling, has been, until quite lately, the most neglected branch of motion picture production." Recognizing the newspaper analogy and the requirements of editorial skill, the newsreel producers promoted key figures as editing directors, whose shaping hands would touch each week's release. Her spokesman, Edward A. McManus, defined the agenda of their film service in the terms of their print standards. Quote, "The well-known Hearst principle of editing, refining, and improving will be carried out here. Hearst, Selig, and Pathé all advertise their editorial directors as print men with editing credentials. Ray Hall from United Press, Jack Wheeler, formerly of the Washington Post, or Eric Mayle from the Pathé Gazette in London. The war brought new demands, expectations, and the American War News Weekly from General Films, which sold its authority on the presentation of its editing director, Captain Robert R. Reynolds, quote, "an amalgamation of soldier, author, journalist, and outdoor sportsman, shaping the footage received from his, quote, battery of camera respondents." If you want a new word, you can write that one down. Like Burton Holmes, the nationally known travel name synonymous with personally supervising the editing and assembling of Paramount's travel pictures, Captain Reynolds was marketed as a special correspondent and the star editorial director of the War News Weekly. His celebrity guest column in Moving Picture World emphasized the need, above all else, for shooting varied coverage for the benefit of the dynamic finishing cut. Quote, "Try to see an event through the eyes of an editor. Don't be a crank turner, be a star reporter." Jack Cohn, editing director of Universal's 3 news services, the Animated Weekly, Current Events, and the Screen Magazine, echoed Reynolds' view that a process of honed journalistic selection provided material for incisive editorial storytelling. Quote, "The cameraman who works for the newsreels now must have the instincts of the newspaper man. He must know what is worth taking and know how to seize the vital moment. And the newsreel director must have editorial judgment. He must be able to sense the public's demands and the enterprise to get it for them. And, as with the editor of a big newspaper, his work is largely that of selection. The work of editing, the cutting out of many hundreds of feet of film to present the few hundreds the public see." As editing and the editor expanded from textual labor and the position of scenario reviser to a second, now more familiar meaning of post-production montage, in which to varying degrees the film is found through editorial processes of selection, experimentation, and refinement, the term becomes paradoxical, pulling cinematic practice and its commentators in 2 directions. On the one hand, we find a prescriptive codification of formal patterns that are to be chosen, arranged, and properly denoted in the edit of the script. Prepared as the strictest blueprint, as commentator S.S. Hutchinson dictates, by no means should a scenario be permitted to be altered as the production progresses. On the other hand, the expanded territory of film editing involved a loosening of obligations to both the pre-existing scenario map and inscription of suggested film cutting codes in favor of a renewed stage of the editing paradigm and the possibility of creative revision. While this might seem a self-evident summation of film editing from our vantage, reconciling and synthesizing the dialectic of editing points out that processes did not occur without resistance during the transitional war years. Along with Hutchinson, Epis Winthrop Sargent protested the, quote, reconstruction of pictures based on his claim that studios edited, quote, the originality out of all stories, debasing them to familiar ingredients and threatening to misuse the very techniques of the cutback and close-up that were in the process of establishing the photoplay, in his view, as a distinct art. Writers similarly complained that film cuts and revisions outside the scenario threatened the coordination of the picture. While, as I have been suggesting, the terminological paradigm and conceptualization of film editing migrated from print to film in these years, the scenario writers distinguished their position from magazine authors and protested that whereas print authors are informed about and then requested to make changes, the film writer had no redress, and is at the mercy of the shears with, quote, so many cuts to the foot, regardless of fitness, utility, or continuity. Scenarists were positioned as the experts, as those practiced and qualified to properly structure a motion picture. As the editorial neglect that Frankie Woods bemoaned dissipated, both in terms of discernible practice, but also in terms of an increased attention to editing in the trade press, and the dialectic between text and film editing was slowly reconciled and synthesized, cinema ascended to a position of equivalence to those media with which it had previously been unfavorably compared. And at that point, one finds the trade press focusing on matters of shooting ratios and even director's cuts. One example would be the heavy reporting of director Herbert Brennan's task of boiling down 220,000 feet of film into 10,000 for Fox's large-scale Annette Kellerman tropical feature Daughter of the Gods in 1916. Another is the interest in Charlie Chaplin's move into editing his own films with Carmen from the same year, Esnay's rejection of Chaplin's reduced cut, and the subsequent public feud and injunction forwarded by Chaplin to block Esnay's re-edited release of the film. By 1916-17, production news stories became increasingly caught up in who is in the cutting room, and at what stage as the filmmakers' names and the jurisdiction of film direction expanded into the post-production edit. There we go. When editing serves as the arena for proving whether an artistic prerogative has been maintained, institutional status has been de facto conferred. But the struggle to understand and define editing's role, articulated for close to a decade in the pages of the trade press, required its own constant cutting and revising. The historical focus on the codification of cutting models, particularly in the aftermath of Griffith, has come to serve as the shorthand summary of a drive toward the practices of continuity and involved narrative editing that followed. But in actuality, the techniques were, in some measure, developed and discussed in opposition to the text-derived paradigm of film editing as a post-production crafting process, where films were shaped, versioned, and finally locked, the dominant idea of editing as we have come to know it. As closer examination of the transitional period will doubtless reveal, the process of institutionalization remained a complex process resisting any quick resolution provided by a deftly inserted fade-out. This analysis of how editing was defined during the later transitional years reveals an industry and its surrounding discourse literally coming to terms with its own practices. But one can also measure how institutionalization takes hold by examining the industry's organized reactions to ideas about cinema expressed by guardians of social standards. One could reasonably argue that cinema faced negative perceptions of its product and conduct before the transitional period, but one finds few strategies of defense predicated on self-definition prior to the post-MPPC era. Arguably, those strategies became even more pronounced and targeted once production coalesces on the West Coast, and lead eventually, I would contend, to the formation of Hollywood as a symbolic site designed to confer attributes of professionalism and normalcy onto the still developing film industry. While debates about the tools of filmmaking chiefly address the realm of aesthetics, articulated anxiety about the exploitative nature of motion pictures, either as product or process, fundamentally questioned the industry's moral compass. Considerable disquietude attended the industry's move to California, as the problems associated with a heterosocial workplace necessitated cohesion across otherwise competitive interests. Indeed, we can view the formation in 1915 and 1916 of protective organizations such as the Motion Picture Directors Association, the Motion Picture Conservation Association, the Motion Picture Protective Organization, and the Motion Picture Producers Association as, collectively, a response to local and national challenges to the industry's authority. On the national level, the mutual decision of 1915, which denied the industry protection under the First Amendment, essentially undercut the industry's claims to cultural credibility. At the local level, a sex scandal in Los Angeles put the industry on the defensive about predatory hiring practices and the exploitation of young women in the newly built and increasingly high-profile studios. Taken together, these two moments in the mid-teens illustrate how the film industry continued to run afoul of progressive reformers who justified their attempts to regulate the motion picture as the moral safeguarding of its audience and employees. These crises also point to how external pressures forced individual studios to consolidate their position as a collective in order to negotiate with Los Angeles and to refine the leadership roles of producers and directors as industry spokesmen. As key moments in the institutionalization of cinema, they demonstrate how self-definition was instrumental for self-protection. Scandal remains synonymous with Hollywood's institutional identity, so it seems fitting that the industry's integration with Los Angeles was propelled by a scandal over immoral hiring practices. The problem started when a local minister accused unnamed directors of taking advantage of young women looking for work in the studios. Although this proto-casting couch, not coach, that would be something different. Although this proto-casting couch scandal remained primarily a local story, reactions to it had ramifications that contributed to forms of industrial self-definition that exceeded municipal boundaries. Newspapers in Los Angeles followed the crisis with enthusiasm. Oh, I like the sound of that. No? What do we think is, oh, I see what's going on. Newspapers in Los Angeles followed the crisis with enthusiasm, chronicling meetings, accusations, anonymous letters, and testimony that called the studios into question as reputable institutions. Deputy District Attorney Claire Woolwine demanded further inquiry and a possible grand jury investigation. This ominous turn of events was mitigated somewhat by the Deputy DA's confidence that any problem associated with motion pictures could quickly be resolved with the cooperation of industry leaders. Although the official investigation was eventually dropped, directors, managers, and producers figured prominently in stories published throughout the year that chronicled abuses of power and sexual corruption. Anxiety about the status of film directors is clear in the Articles of Incorporation for the Motion Picture Directors Association, which explicitly connect reputation and behavior, asserting that the organization's purpose was, quote, to A, maintain the honor and dignity of the profession of motion picture directors, and B, to cultivate the usefulness and exert every influence to improve the moral, social, and intellectual standing of all persons connected with the motion picture producing business. Neither a guild nor a union, the MPDA still shared something in common with these types of organizations, and the MPDA's articles listed its aims as fostering more interaction between members and helping distressed members and their wives and families. Yet, at a time when the directing field was not yet entirely dominated by men, the formation of the MPDA also asserted the collective identity of directors as responsible, respectable, and male. Organizations such as the MPDA helped craft an official voice that could speak for the industry, allowing one director to stand for many in meetings involving the city, women's groups, and business organizations. Just as the immoral studio crisis seemed to be contained, the fallout from the mutual decision, rendered earlier that same year, embroiled the industry in a national debate about film censorship. In this instance, the court's vindication of censorship as a moral imperative propelled the formation of another protective organization, the Motion Picture Producers Association, or MPPA. The MPPA originated in late 1915 with meetings between producers who were emphatically opposed to local and national censorship bureaus. The formation of protective organizations aligned different studios against a common threat. And while there were several other identifiable impending problems during this period, labor management, increasing production costs, star salaries, the issue of censorship united filmmaking companies with one another. Moreover, the specter of censorship also helped to align the newly formed MPPA with the interests of LA's broader business community and municipal government, all of them devoted to ensuring healthy regional commerce. The mutual decision, however, which was handed down in February of 1915, was certainly a blow to the industry's uplift agenda and anti-censorship crusade. And it also demonstrated how local problems, in this instance a complaint that originated in Ohio, could play out on the national stage. The court's condemnation of cinema's prurient appeal coincided with the hiring practice scandal, and collectively these two flashpoints demonstrated how cinema's moral turpitude encompassed both the production and the consumption of motion pictures. As we have seen, studio management moved quickly to manage its image problem in Los Angeles. The implications of the mutual decision, though, proved harder to contain. Following the mutual decision and tied to the invidious popularity of white slave films, the Hughes Bill, designed to institute a federally regulated censorship commission, was reintroduced in court and became a source of considerable anxiety for the film industry. Again, filmmakers in Los Angeles found a way to deal with the threat on a local level. While hearings for the Hughes Bill were being conducted in Washington, a series of meetings was held between city officials and industry representatives that helped to solidify the MPPA's standing as a voice of industry interest. Thomas Dixon, in retrospect they might have chosen someone else, but Thomas Dixon met with the city council in the name of producers and exhibitors to protest censorship and to promote, quote, the wizardry and artistry of the screen, promising that it would be possible to bring all the Eastern studios to Los Angeles if only the city offered the industry fair treatment. Director D.W. Griffith appeared before the Women's Million Club to discuss art in the motion pictures and the problems of making art, quote, in the face of unnecessary censorship. Editorials in the Los Angeles Herald also pushed back at censorship legislation. Beginning in late January, articles by prominent filmmakers based in Los Angeles, such as Griffith, Thomas Ince, H.O. Davis of Universal, and H.M. Horkheimer of Balboa, were published under the shared title, Public Opinion and Censorship, Enough for Motion Pictures. These articles railed against the ongoing threat of censorship, arguing that it amounted to class legislation that was unfair and unconstitutional. More pointedly, they argued that their audience was able to judge film content for itself. In this, they were supported by the Los Angeles Herald's editorial pages, which published a cartoon illustrating the producer's argument that if a film was offensive, the audience could speak with its feet. When the Hughes Bill was not adopted, the Herald proclaimed victory for the campaign against censorship that had radiated from Los Angeles under the auspices of the MPPA. The celebratory posture of the Herald demonstrates how the organizational efforts of the film industry depended upon support from various LA institutions, such as the Merchants and Manufacturing Association, the Realty Board, and the Los Angeles Police Department. Taken together, sex scandals and legal challenges such as the mutual decision illustrate how the film industry continued to run afoul of progressive reformers who justified their attempts to regulate the motion pictures as the moral safeguarding of its audience and employees. These crises also point to how external pressures forced individual studios to consolidate their position as a collective in order to negotiate with the city and to refine the leadership roles of producers and directors as industry spokesmen. If Hollywood was the ultimate byproduct of this move toward collective identity, it came about only because of a diverse range of discourses aimed at defining the American film industry in marketable and palatable terms. By the early 1920s, Hollywood had accumulated the logic of a fixed geographical point, but more importantly, it had become a useful symbolic site. The name signaled the existence of a center of American filmmaking, but the formation of that center occurred through an extended negotiation amongst competing forces that found common cause in the defense of industrial interests and the promotion of a culturally appealing image. These two case studies, illustrating the discursive face of institutionalization, demonstrate that the transitional era progressively became a testing ground for forms of effective self-definition that extended far beyond the screen. If indeed attraction went underground during the transitional era, the earlier kinds of definitional uncertainty focused more on medium-specific issues, gave way to the social role and economic effectivity of a burgeoning institution. Agents of change during the transitional era might not have expressed a consensus about what editing was or what a director should do, but we can say now that the course of transition entailed a process of sorting out such questions. As historians, we may have much to learn by exploring the particular uncertainties that define this era, an era I now think ends with mutual agreement concerning the meaning and efficacy of Hollywood as a term connoting how and where American movies were made. Perhaps cinema could exist without Hollywood, but one could not have Hollywood unless there was cinema. Thank you.